Good afternoon, colleagues. Good evening, good morning to everybody. I hope the sound is clear and everybody can hear me. This is Tanya, the IASC Secretariat, and I'm hosting this IASC briefing today on the interagency humanitarian evaluations of both the drought response in Ethiopia and the response to Cyclone Idai in Mozambique. Please use the chat if there's any problem with the sound. If you want to post a comment, if you ask a question, please use this chat function and our team is going to make sure that you will be able to connect and to hear well. For now, I would like to warmly welcome all of you. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar. And I really hope that you're all keeping healthy and safe during these challenging times. Some housekeeping to start with. The webinar will last approximately 90 minutes and it's structured as follows. We have an introduction, then we have brief remarks from the panelists, and then we have quite an extensive Q&A where you can ask your questions and we can engage in dialogue. And then we have very brief closing remarks. As I said before, please use the chat box to communicate with everybody on this webinar, as well as to share your questions. Please note that we'll record this webinar and we'll place it afterwards on our website. So for everybody who has not been able to dial in today, you can do so in the future. And please keep your microphones on mute so that we can understand our presenters and you are able to ask your question. Thank you very much. And we also, even though it's rather uncomfortable to speak to a computer, please keep your videos off. We are thrilled to provide a forum today to discuss the important findings of these two most recent interagency humanitarian evaluation reports. But what is an IAHE? An interagency humanitarian evaluation is an independent assessment of the results of the humanitarian response by member organizations of the Interagency Standing Committee. IAHEs evaluate the extent to which planned collective results have been achieved and how humanitarian reform efforts have contributed to this achievement. IAHEs may be triggered by an IASC scale-up activation. We'll speak more about both just now. The evaluation for Ethiopia was conducted between December 2018 and October 2019 for the drought response that took place in Ethiopia between 2015 and 2018. This was primarily the El Nino drought. Please, colleagues, can you keep your microphones muted? Thank you very much. So this was primarily the El Nino drought that started in 2015 and the Indian Ocean dipole drought in 2017. For Mozambique, in June 2019, the IASC Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Mark Lowcock, launched an IAHE on the scale-up humanitarian response to Cyclone Idai. The cyclone hit Mozambique on the 14th of March 2019, and it was one of the worst tropical cyclones on record to affect Africa and the Southern Hemisphere. But without further ado, I have the great pleasure to welcome our panel today. I'm joined today by Ms. Kelly David, who's the chair of the IAHE Steering Group, an IASC associated entity with the aim to ensure system-wide learning and accountability on the effectiveness of collective humanitarian response efforts. In order to inform and shape future policies and operations. Within OCHA, Mrs. David oversees the strategic planning, monitoring and evaluation and advises senior leadership on managing organizational risks. Prior to this, Ms. David headed OCHA's country operations in Liberia and Somalia, as well as OCHA's regional offices for East and Southern Africa. I'm also joined by Dr. Julia Steets. She's the director of GPPi, an independent think tank in Berlin, Germany. In addition to leading the IAHE for the drought response in Ethiopia, Dr. Steets has also led evaluations of UNHCR's engagement in humanitarian development cooperation and an evaluation of WFP's policies on humanitarian principles and access in humanitarian contexts, and a joint FAO WFP evaluation of the food security cluster. Finally, I'm joined by Mr. Jock Baker. Jock Baker is an independent consultant for many years, following approximately 2 decades with various UN organizations and international NGOs, mostly field-based assignments in the Pacific, Asia, and Africa. In addition to leading the IAHE for the Cyclone Idai Response in Mozambique, Mr. Baker has led thematic studies, lessons learned reviews, strategic reviews, and evaluations exploring a range of thematic areas, including resilience, humanitarian financing, accountability to affected populations, and the humanitarian development nexus. Welcome to our panelists. As with usual practice, we first hear now from the panelists, and then we are opening the floor for approximately 40 to 45 minutes of questions and answers. Please do use the chat box, as I said before, to share your thoughts and to flag any questions that you might have. Our panelists will answer after their presentations. But let us start. Kelly, over to you. Perhaps you can help to frame our discussion today. Can you tell us a little bit more about the background and the use of IAHEs? Kelly, please go. Kelly, we cannot hear you. You're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, very well.
Excellent, glad. All right, thank you very much, Tanya. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today and to share the results of these 2 important interagency humanitarian evaluations, IAHEs for short. But as Tanya suggested, first a bit of background on our work and why we do it. An IAHE is an independent assessment of the results of collective humanitarian response by IASC organizations to a specific crisis or theme. In the most basic sense, they are designed to answer the question, did we do what we said we were going to do in our humanitarian response plans, policies, and cooperation frameworks? What went right and what could be improved? As such, their primary objective is to strengthen learning, but also to promote accountability towards affected people, national governments, donors, and the public. Some are automatically triggered as per IASC protocols for all new or exacerbated emergencies for which significantly scaled up capacities or resources are deployed. Others, such as our first ever global thematic evaluation on the gender equality and empowerment of women and girls, which will be released on Wednesday as part of the kickoff to the 16 days of action, are meant to address broader policy challenges in recognition of the importance of cross-cutting issues in humanitarian program. A word about what they are not. An IAHE is not an in-depth assessment or evaluation of any one sector or of the performance of a specific organization. And as such, they never replace any other form of agency-specific humanitarian evaluation. They do, however, build on other evaluative evidence and reviews that may have been undertaken by specific agencies. The IAHE Steering Group consists of the evaluation directors of OCHA, of which I'm the chair, WFP, FAO, UNHCR, UNFPA, WHO, UNICEF, IOM, UNDP, the International Federation of the Red Cross, the Steering Committee on Humanitarian Response, an NGO representative, which is currently the Danish Refugee Council, and ALNEP. Since 2018, the IAHE Steering Group has conducted dozens of system-wide evaluations of UN, Red Cross, and NGO humanitarian action. The learning from which has informed major policy initiatives such as the Transformative Agenda and the Agenda for Humanity. Today we're going to discuss 2 of our most recently concluded evaluations. The first evaluation ever to examine the humanitarian response to multiple recurring droughts year on year in Ethiopia. And the second is the first formal and independent lessons on the new international scale-up mechanism, which was first triggered to provide rapid and increased emergency response capacities and resources in support of the government of Mozambique in responding to Cyclone Idai in March 2019. Before Jock and Julie tell you what they found, I'd like to share some key points about how they arrived at their conclusions. How do we conduct an IAHE? Firstly, in both evaluations, we undertook what were the first ever household surveys used in an IAHE to capture feedback from people on how we did. As some of you may know, our monitoring data is not always what we wish it would be, so these surveys are unique in providing a concrete evidence base for responders on what worked well and what didn't from the view of the people they were meant to serve. Affected communities were involved not only in household surveys I just mentioned, but participated in focus group discussions and selected interviews. Further, in each evaluation, around 200 partner responders, including government, were interviewed. Extensive document review and data analysis was also undertaken. And before finalizing their recommendations, the evaluators shared and discussed their preliminary findings with various groups to validate, test, and refine them. For instance, in Ethiopia, such validation workshops were held in each of the 5 regions visited, in Addis and at the global level in Geneva. In Mozambique, there was a special workshop held only with the government. Lastly, IAHEs are increasingly using local partners to ensure greater ownership of the data and results, but also to build local capacity to conduct such evaluations. For instance, in Mozambique, we partnered with Eduardo Mondlane University to conduct the beneficiary survey, the results of which are now also being used for local research and to train students in research methods. The results of both evaluations were also disseminated in local languages to people. Before I hand back to the moderator, I would like to make one final point about the significance of these evaluations. At present, it is only the humanitarian system under the mandate of the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator, presently Mark Lowcock, that has been conducting collective and independent assessments of its work. This type of effort, that is joint interagency system-wide evaluation, only recently became a key pillar of the Secretary General's management reforms and is now expected to be extended to the development sphere as well. So in some ways, we are pioneers in this regard. And the quality and evidence base of our IAHEs is only growing. They are a unique means of providing robust evidence in very specific ways on the effectiveness of humanitarian response. And I hope that you find them as informative as we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for this introduction and for setting the framework for this webinar. Doc, Mr. Baker, I would like to pass on to you. Can you tell us about your experience evaluating the scale-up response in Mozambique?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm destined for infamy here because it seems like it's the first interagency evaluation, the IAHEA, that's been done on after the scale-up, on a scale-up emergency. Previously, I think most of you know that this was the L3. The difference between the scale up and the L3 is fairly subtle, but it was designed, in fact, for a quick onset disaster like Mozambique, in that it's, you know, with L3 that was being applied to all emergencies with a slow onset, quick onset. This is the scale up is specifically for quick onset. It's time bound. It's maximum 6 months, and in the case of Mozambique, it was just over 3 months. So it was declared on, I believe, that March 23rd and was closed June 30th. So by the time we did the field visits, it had been over for a couple of months, and we arrived in September to do the field visits, and then the household survey was delayed a bit because of the national elections, mainly because of the national elections, and so that didn't take place until November rather. So it was that gave us a chance to kind of have a look at downstream at some of the outcomes of the scale-up emergency, which happened in March, April, May, and June. So I think what I'll say is that I mean the other significant aim of the scale up is to promote a collective response, and I think based on our experience, I think we could say that worked quite. I mean, my first IAHEA was in Cyclone Idai in 2008 in Myanmar, And if I do a longitudinal comparison between the kind of collaboration I saw at that time and now, it's really night and day. There was significant amount of collaboration throughout. Actually, I mean, I noticed there's a couple of members of the steering committee on the chat, so I would take the opportunity to thank them, because it really was a team effort from the steering group, and also at the HCT. There's some very good collaboration, and the OCHA regional office in Nairobi, who deployed quite a lot of capacity from there during the response. I mean, it was a lot of working together. So it wasn't just evaluating a kind of collective response. It was also, we benefited from a collective support throughout the evaluation. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we can talk a little bit now about Ethiopia. Dr. Steets, it's clear that the evaluations cover two very different contexts, but can you tell us whether there were common findings between the two evaluations of the response in Mozambique and the drought response in Ethiopia, and what were those common findings?
Thanks very much, Tanya, indeed. As you said, the emergencies were very different. On the one hand, we have Ethiopia, which had droughts, so a slow onset type of emergency, and we had a repeated set of droughts over the years that were also then compounded by other emergencies, conflict, displacement. You have probably heard about locusts, also floods, and all that happening in a country that has quite a strong state and government system. Now in Mozambique, by contrast, we were looking at a very sudden onset type of emergency, a storm or storms, in a probably more overall fragile government setting, and one, as Jock said, where we had a IASC scale-up activation, which we did not have in Ethiopia. So when we sat together to compare findings and figure out whether or not we found commonalities between the findings, despite these contexts being so different, we were quite struck at just how many similar findings we had. And let me go into them, and perhaps to start with what went well. The first thing, and that will be on the next slide, is about coordination and the link to government systems. What you see here on the slide, and I'm sorry it's a little bit crowded, but it is that complicated. That is the coordination system that was put into place in Ethiopia. And what we found when we looked at both the coordination in Ethiopia and the one in Mozambique is that by and large, the coordination was quite strong. So in both situations did we have the cluster system and strong cluster performance, particularly in the many cases where we had dedicated cluster coordinators. I think a very important element that we also saw in both cases was that a so-called deputy HC, a deputy humanitarian coordinator, was deployed. That is an additional leadership position that is deployed to the field, be a little bit closer to the ground and provide the leadership and coordination. And in both cases, these functions, the deputy humanitarian coordinator, positive contribution. Now, coordination is something that is probably never perfect. So we did also found a few weak points concerning coordination. Foremost, this is that the coordination process as such tends to be onerous. It's a lot of meetings, particularly in the country capitals. There is usually a difficulty to connect what happens in the capital to what happens on the ground. It's difficult to include all the local actors who are such important early responders. It's always difficult to make intercluster coordination work, and it's an uphill struggle to get the humanitarian country teams, those core decision-making bodies, to turn into real strategic decision-making rather than information sharing meetings. But I think we need to take these small criticisms really with a grain of salt, particularly considering that we need to strike a good balance between having a system that is still manageable, where people still have time to work on the emergency rather than spending so much time in coordination, and mechanisms to address these issues that I just outlined. And I want to draw your particular attention to one fact that we found very strong in both emergency responses, and that is something that when we did similar reviews 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we did not see to that extent. And that is that there was close cooperation between the international response system and the governments, the host governments. This is really important on the one hand because it avoids creating parallel systems. So for instance, there is a social safety net system in Ethiopia, and it was possible to adapt that and expand that to help respond to the droughts. This helps to avoid undermining local systems and local capacities, and even to strengthen them so that we have stronger capacities at the end of the response. So we have some evidence that, for example, logistics capacity, even after the end of the response, remains stronger, and that certain health teams were stronger and had better capacity after the response compared to before. So this factor that the international system worked well with the local system is one of the major factors to explain why both responses were relatively successful. Now, what do we mean by successful? And here I want to turn to the next slide in the presentation. Success in a humanitarian response, of course, means saving lives. And I'm sorry, we need to go one slide further. Here we are. This is usually something that is quite hard to prove because it's a counterfactual. You know, we're trying to say how many people did not die. But in both evaluations, we found enough evidence to substantiate the general claim that many lives were saved here. What is this evidence? On the left-hand side, you will find some graph pertaining to Ethiopia. We asked the people themselves directly what would have happened if there had been no assistance. And you can see that a huge number of them says there would have been more death in my families, more people in my family would have died. These are 58% of the respondents, really a huge number. Also, you can see here that displacement was another negative consequence that many people felt was avoided due to the response. In Ethiopia, we had another few data points, including, for example, that the treatment of severe acute malnutrition was successful and corresponded to international standards, or we had some study that showed that there were improved food consumption scores. So all in all, different data points that help us prove that indeed the response helped to save many lives. In Mozambique, and this is the chart on the right-hand side here, we had a case where a potential second emergency, namely a cholera outbreak, was contained very quickly and effectively through the international response. As you can see here, the number of cases within a few weeks really went down pretty much to zero. We also have data that shows that 20% of households received aid within a few days of the emergency, so very quickly. And when people were asked what they felt about it, they said 60% of them said that they really felt they received what they needed and that they received it at the right time. Positive factors, as I said, something that really enabled that was the close cooperation with the government. We also had early warning systems that worked quite well in both countries, even though following early warning with early action worked better in Mozambique than in Ethiopia. And we saw that this strengthened systems capacity of the international humanitarian system to deploy and respond really worked out well. Down at the bottom of the slide here, you see a couple of caveats and cautions, because there were also some limiting factors, of course, and these are related to the very mechanisms we have developed to scale up and respond quickly. And that brings with it a high turnover of international surge staff. And the higher the turnover is, the more it affects quality, continuity, but also cost effectiveness. And it is one of these areas where it's probably just two sides of the same coin. I'd like to look at a third and last area where things have gone well, which would be on the next slide of this presentation, which has to do with protection. Can we have the next slide in the presentation? Fantastic, thank you. Now, in many other responses, I think it's a consistent finding that insufficient attention to protection concerns is a shortcoming. And we found it very encouraging that in both cases, we see significant effort and progress over time, even though I would say it's an area that remains there to be strengthened. Let me start with Mozambique this time. Here we had a situation where actually in the beginning, particularly the protection cluster was not very strong because it did not have a dedicated coordinator. But despite that fact, we had a strong recognition that the centrality of protection is important from the very beginning of the response. There was a working group created, particularly to address protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. And it developed an interagency hotline that you can see the picture here, which had several functions. People could call it to request information. They could call it to report issues, general issues, but also issues relating to sexual exploitation and abuse, to corruption, also to political violence. And they were also invited to provide positive feedback. Now, it took some time to set up this system, but in the end, it was quite well accepted and received over 3,500 calls, mainly complaints. People usually take longer to pick up the phone to say thank you, and that was great. But I think something that is quite encouraging is that the number of calls on protection cases, sexual abuse cases, and harassment cases was very small. It was 15 cases, and all of these then triggered investigations. So something very encouraging to see here. In Ethiopia, again, we saw initially, in particular, quite a weak consideration for protection issues. But then it started to develop, and there was more of a political opening to talk about protection, look at protection. The cluster was established and made some steps in order to include, for example, protection issues into needs assessments. But despite some efforts in Ethiopia, the system did not manage to set up a collective complaints mechanism like the one in Mozambique. With that, I'll leave it at those common issues where we saw progress and where things went well, and hand back to Tanya, our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Colleagues, please feel free to share with us your comments and your questions in the chat box, to both of the presenters, please. Thank you. Jock, now that we know what went well, please, can you tell us all the areas that did not go quite so well and that could have been improved, and what are the lessons that we can draw?
Sure. Yeah, you can tell I lost the coin toss with Julia. I'm the bad cop here. But just to kind of repeat, maybe go back to the just to finish on the positive note with the Mozambique government. I think you know that the cholera response was not just a joint response with the international community. I mean, the scale up is all about supporting capacities, and Mozambique, the government is maybe not as kind of perceived as forceful as in Ethiopia, but the disaster management agency in Mozambique is quite well renowned, I think, in the region for being quite strong, and they demonstrated that. And in fact, they moved the whole, whereas in Ethiopia most of the meetings were in the capital, in Mozambique it was the opposite. The director of and the deputy director, and even the minister charged with coordinating the response, they all moved down to the affected area and were coordinating decentralized. So the deployment of a deputy DHC to it was really, well, was essential. Really, it really was good that was deployed, and they were deployed to the field. So that was really good. And I mean, I should just also thank the director Augustine and her team from the National Disaster Management Agency, because they really supported us as well. I mean, we would not have been able to do those surveys without their support actually at the provincial level. So I just slipped that in, and then we'll go to the what can be better. Next slide. Okay, first of all, as Julius mentioned, I mean, it was kind of this mutual surprise moment, saying, you got a drought, slow onset emergency. I've got a quick onset cyclone. These things are going to be completely different. And actually it's not. And so that's sort of an indicator for us. And I mean, having done a few of these before, I mean, I think it's something that we see come up, and it's not to kind of point fingers, it's more like, and particularly agencies, it's as Kelly said, these IAHEs are really looking at the collective responses. How did they perform? How did the international system perform as a collective whole? And what can we learn from these responses? Okay, one of the things was there was certainly, in the case of there were certainly these needs assessment, data collection, and analysis capacity. In the case of Mozambique, there was actually an assessment cell that was set up after the disaster with different organizations coordinated by OCHA. So there was a multi-sector rapid assessment done. There was a PDNA, post-disaster needs assessment done. There were different types of needs assessment, but it was quite based on feedback from those who were involved in the response. It was quite challenging to get a kind of real-time picture of priority needs. Part of it was difficulties in access in Mozambique, but it's also the kind of systems whereby agencies are kind of used to collecting their own data, and it's clear that it's getting better in terms of collecting that together and coming out with something that's useful. But in the case of Mozambique, and I think other studies have shown this, that the Humanitarian Response Plan, which is the kind of instrument which is supposed to show what the needs are and so forth, sometimes it's not perfectly fit for purpose. I mean, it's a good communications and resource mobilization tool. I think that's everybody agreed on in country that was useful for that. But in terms of understanding what people's needs were at any given time, there was kind of limits there, partly because of the context, because of the difficulty in accessing areas in terms of the actual infrastructure and things like that, but partly because there's some more refinement needed. Okay, next slide. So the recommendations from Ethiopia was continue efforts to, well, I think from both actually. I mean, it's clearly there's been progress made. It's more a recommendation in terms of continue to improve what's there already, continue to learn and improve on what's there, improve the accountability, the kind of component that's concerned with accountability to affected populations. We'll see in a minute in one of the later slides what that looks like in practice. And in the case of it in Mozambique, you know, in general, the scale during the scale period, because of the good cooperation between government and the international agencies, because there was quite good preparedness and early action within the country, really the kind of death and suffering was mitigated to a large extent, I think, during the actual scale period. But then what we saw later on was that there was quite a few unmet needs for various regions. Okay, should we go on to the next one? Time is running. So this is what I was referring to with the accountability to affected populations. So there were some positive things here. I mean, this is from the household surveys in both in Ethiopia and Mozambique. Very positive feedback in terms of the behavior of aid workers. The vast majority did feel like they were treated with respect, and also that the aid was distributed equally. I mean, majorities thought that. Okay, where were the kind of gaps? There was very little knowledge of what they were going to receive before they received it. It just turned up. And also, particularly in Mozambique, as Julia mentioned, I mean, there was a common complaints system set up. And it was originally, before the disaster, it was an WFP. There was a fairly quick decision to convert that into an interagency mechanism, and a lot of support by different agencies to make that happen. It took time to gain the trust and communicate. And these are, of course, some of the worst affected populations were quite remote, and so there was some infrastructure issues. There was they weren't used to this type of thing. So it took time for the complaint system to get functional in Mozambique. So, and then there's this difference between equity and equality. So in many cases, it's more kind of left to the local leaders to distribute, and as part of their kind of conflict resolution mechanisms, there's a kind of equal distribution, and that's part of it was also due to the fact that they didn't, you know, that the agencies had their own vulnerability criteria, the targeting criteria, but there wasn't necessarily an awareness of that by the people that were actually distributing that. And so as a result, you got a lot of equal distribution, but in terms of when you asked in Mozambique in particular, when we asked households, did those that get it needed the most, did they get their assistance? Only a third said yes. Okay, should we go to the next one? So in terms of the recommendations there, I think, I mean, both the experience from both Ethiopia and Mozambique kind of confirmed the added value of having these household surveys embedded in the methodology of these IAHEs, because it's important for accountability to affected populations, but it also, given that you have this, another finding, for example, within the Mozambique one, is that you get a lot of variation in terms of the measurement systems, and that's partly because of the gaps in the sort of turnover and so forth, and the different capacities within the clusters and so forth. Some have quite good performance measuring, others there were gaps. And particularly when it comes time to measuring outcomes, it was quite difficult, challenging to compare some of that. Whereas the household surveys, that gives you the real outcome data. Okay, so what actually happened? What over different periods of time during the scale-up period, after the scale-up period, what happened? What were your needs, and how, to what extent did you get the assistance you needed? Those were, those people, they don't turn over; they're still there. They may move, but it was a fairly useful way of capturing that their perspectives. But in addition, we both of us, both the IAHEs, we did these qualitative interviews in face-to-face in those back in the day when we could do those sort of things, but also because of the remoteness of some of the locations, we did both of us did quite a few in remote interviews by phone, and not just with community members, but also because of the sort of turnover process. Both of us, we were to capture perspectives of people that have been deployed during the initial phases of that. I mean, for example, in Mozambique, we found only a handful of people in September that had been there in June, let alone in April. So we, with the help of the HCT and OCHA, we managed to track, and the other agencies themselves, we managed to track down quite a few people that have been deployed during the early stages. Okay, and for Ethiopia, I mean, one of the recommendations is to provide this interagency complaints mechanism, and I think based on the experience in Mozambique, which is, I mean, we documented in the IAHE, but it's also been subject of a recent paper in the ODI Humanitarian Practice Network. So if you're interested in that, I recommend having a look at that. Okay. We go to the next. So we mentioned, Julia talked about the strong relationship with a strong cooperation, working relationship with the government. That's both before and during and after. I mean, continues in terms of updating preparedness and so forth. So in both countries, it's very strong. But for the civil society part, it wasn't so strong, to put it mildly, especially in Mozambique, where there's not really any kind of national NGOs as such. So there was a kind of difficulty in fitting into this large scale-up international response. And we found that contributed to some of the gaps that have been seen in the response in terms of community-based preparedness. So those of you that looked at the report will have seen some of the early action results from the household survey is basically that virtually all of the households we interviewed, they received early warning messages, but it was only the minority that actually took any early action, and that was for various reasons, ranging from the main reason was wanting to stay and protect their assets. Other reason was nowhere else to go, and another reason was they just didn't think that it was going to be as bad as it was. They didn't trust the information. So that's clearly a role where based on experience from other quick onset disasters, like in the Philippines, for example, or Bangladesh. I mean, the civil society played a very big role in kind of mobilizing early action and disaster mitigation. Also, in terms of addressing particular, this equity versus equality type of thing, it was felt that the civil society organizations would have been able to help with that too. Funding is also an issue, as it shown with the Ethiopia IAHE, that very little funding actually goes directly to local agencies. Although, of course, there's funding that travels through via the international, but it's there is a kind of layer thing. Okay, next one. So in Ethiopia, in terms of funding, there's a recommendation to lower the bar for national and local NGOs to participate in the country-based pool fund. And also, similar to Mozambique, is looking at ways to strengthen capacity so that they can participate more constructively in international coordination mechanisms where international agencies are present. In Mozambique, because it's quite, I mean, it's not that well developed civil society organization, so there was also another recommendation related to trying to improve the capacity. Well, first of all, know what's there, and also to build capacity. Okay. Next one. Another common area finding was this perpetual early recovery, which is continues to be a challenge. It's something that gets better. It's improving, but seems to continue to be a challenge. In Ethiopia, only 18% of households felt they were in a better position to cope with a similar drought. In Mozambique, we asked during the household survey, we asked the question, you know, compared to before the cyclone, are you better off or worse off? And a large majority, between 58 and 67%, said that they were not, and they were definitely not better off. Especially those that had been displaced and then gone back to their places of origin. One of the interesting findings that kind of was a bit surprising is that some actually found that they, you know, some areas they felt like they'd improved, and this was based on, because these were mostly rural populations that had, before the cyclone, they didn't really have access to service. They had difficult access to services. After the cyclone, some of the health services, or some of those that had been moved to resettlement sites, had better access to services. So in some cases it did improve, but the majority, it was tough, and we saw that. Okay. Oh, and maybe just to mention, I mean, there were a longer term recovery plan, but I think the main challenge, certainly in Mozambique, was that you know, the scale up period finished. The scale up finished 30th of June, and because of various factors, including this national election, which I mentioned, there was a world, you know, the long term recovery effort being mobilized, but that didn't really get moving until well into 2020. I mean, a year later, I think. So there was this sort of transition period between the end of the scale up that there. Some of the clusters managed better than others, but it wasn't kind of an overall consistent effort. And part of that was funding issues, because some of the donors we spoke to, I mean, they had put aside funds to, they were allocating funds to the longer term one, and not necessarily to this transition period. Okay, should we go to the next? So there's this, generally, I think both cases, it's urging donors to look at that early recovery period between the end of the emergency phase and you know, getting the longer term recovery up to speed, and it comes back to this sort of data management and communication as well, to make sure that those needs are also communicated to donors, because the donors are, as we know from the grand bargain discussions, they're open to these, and many have adopted longer term funding. They're more flexible funding, so it's giving them the information they need. Okay. So what lessons do we still need to learn? This was kind of an overall kind of reflection on the overall processes. So we were, in terms of the Ethiopia, as Kelly mentioned in the beginning, this was part of a kind of a longitudinal study, almost evaluation, that there had been a previous evaluation done, and so one of that team's task was to look at to what extent the recommendations from the previous evaluation had followed up. There they found some challenges there. For Mozambique, we've, there were, as those of you who read the report would have seen that we found different, the clusters we had different levels of performance. The 3 clusters that performed the best, which is logistics, ETC, and WASH, of all the clusters that were planning or had already started after action reviews, it was ETC and WASH and logistics. Those were the only 2 that were planning after action reviews, which kind of is an we didn't really get this. Our team didn't really get a sense of how the learning. I mean, we can see that learning was taking place, but in terms of systematizing it, it didn't seem to be happening. Similarly, in terms of, there was an operational peer review conducted in May in Mozambique. There wasn't, we couldn't really find any kind of action plan that would follow up on those, the agreed follow-up actions that had been made, and also management responses to previous, well, in the case of Mozambique, the previous one was over a decade ago, but I think in the case of Ethiopia, there was not management response yet. So it's just, I think the overall message is, it's not that the interagency system, IASC humanitarian system is not learning, they are learning, but it's, I think our sense was that it could be more systematic. Okay, thanks. So yeah, I think I've already. So these recommendations basically just become more systematic. There's more systematic follow-up, which this is one of them. I mean, Julia and I were kind of happy to be invited to do this. That's an indicator that this IASC is interested in following up. So that's a good indicator already. And I think also in terms of, we would just kind of give it's a chance also to offer our reflections based on what might help to systematize this the learning, the collective learning. Okay, thanks.
Excellent, thanks. And we have had our first question. So before I ask my next question, I want to go to the questions that are coming from our audience. And the first one, I believe, is to Julia, but Jock, do feel free to come in as well. So when you say that all reported PSEA cases triggered investigations, can you specify from who? And do we mean follow-up from humanitarian agencies or actual judicial investigations? And I will combine that with the next question. Considering the significant time, effort, and financial resources that went into the surveys of the affected populations, it would be helpful to hear whether this modality is worth it. For example, as opposed to other ways of obtaining feedback from affected populations. Also, from an ethical standpoint, what, if any, risks arise during the survey process? So, for example, around people's expectations of assistance as a result of having shared their feedback, etc. Maybe we can also take the next one because it's connected. I'm not sure I understood your analysis regarding the fact that only 1/3 of the population said that the assistance reached or benefited those who needed it most in Mozambique. Is there any associated recommendation around this? Julia, over to you. And Jock, please feel free to come in.
Thanks very much, Tanya. I would actually take the second one since the other 2 are both explicitly on Mozambique, and I think Jock is better placed to answer those. But on the surveys, are they worth it? I would say absolutely. It cost us sweat and gray hair and money to do them, but I think it's absolutely indispensable actually to get that kind of first-hand information from affected people. I mean, if we had a monitoring system and a feedback system that was interagency and that continuously delivered this kind of data, I would say then we wouldn't need those. But for now, we don't really have that. And in Ethiopia, for instance, we have a huge issue with the credibility of data, because a lot of data comes also through the government or is co-produced, and there's a lot of suspicions, at least, or that data is massaged in certain ways. So we felt that in terms of learning about what really went well and where the real gaps were, it was absolutely indispensable. What about the risks and the costs? We discussed these at length, and we decided that if we went in with a team of university researchers that often go to these areas actually to do research for university studies, and had a huge disclaimer right at the beginning that this had nothing to do with kind of directing the future response, and that people it's a research element, so to manage expectations very, very carefully, that we could do it. We had a very interesting discussion actually on whether or not we should offer a small incentive for people to participate, like some soap, or in Ethiopia, a small bag of coffee or something like that, which we initially wanted to do because our understanding was that in the university research, they often do that. But then as we discussed that with the humanitarians in the humanitarian country team, some of them said, look, no, be really careful. You don't want to set a precedent when we do needs assessments and so on, that people expect immediate payoffs like that. And so we left it out. And in the end, from all those researchers who went out there, when they debriefed us, they said they were extremely well received in the communities, and they took great care to explain what this was about, and then people were happy to respond. And I know that people are often fatigued, but they will let you know. And so I think you need to do it carefully, but I would say absolutely it's worth it.
Okay, should I jump in?
If you wish, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I can kind of take off from Julia's point and finish off with the surveys, and then address the other 2 points, which I understand were about the complaints mechanism, PSEA, and
Yes.
the 1/3 equity versus equality, put it that way. Okay, so in terms of the household survey, for us it was much more complicated, I think, than Ethiopia. We used a very good team, as Kelly mentioned. We had help from a university in Mozambique, National University, whose team leader is one of Mozambique's foremost DRR experts, Luis Artur, who was actually from the affected, originally born in the affected area, actually. So, I mentioned the help of the Disaster Management Agency. That was just so critical. I mean, originally we had planned to do this in October, but the national elections were there, and of course, when you mix politics and aid, it gets very messy, and so we had quite a lot of challenges. One thing is that it was done later than we had planned, but we needed a very strong communication strategy in place to ensure that, first of all, it was understood that this was it wasn't part of the selection process. It was just asking, and it was not providing aid, because obviously there were still unmet needs. So and also that it was voluntary. I mean, and so we did have some dropouts, but actually it was a minority. Most of the households did participate, and the training of the enumerators was excellent. I mean, in terms of ethics and everything. We had one of my team members, Tristy, who was doing the quality assurance for the team, and participating in the training. I mean, just very, very impressive, actually, how they did that and how they managed. They had a lot of challenges, but that was overcome, I think. So it needs. I think the main lesson out of that was that it's not just doing the survey, but you need a really strong communication strategy and support from local actors, and preferably from national actors, as we did with Disaster Management Agency. The kind of yeah, for the complaint system, I mean, the vast majority were not related to PSEA cases. I think that the small number, actually, the sense was more that it was being underreported, and but at the same time, what we came out of this in terms of what the judgments we made was that actually, even though it took some time to gain momentum, because of the collective focus on this thing, and I mentioned communication strategy for the household survey. In the case of this complaint system, they had very strong communication strategies. So they had messages that were disseminated by the agencies themselves. They had training for local leaders, which is where, in the initial phases, actually, it was most of the cases identified were local leaders, and they had awareness raising sessions. They had training. They had they supported local radio stations, not just with PSEA related messages, but it was mixed in with public health and so forth. And it was quite a concerted and well coordinated response. Of course, it wasn't perfect, but at the same time, I think you could say that, okay, the kind of the judicial processes were probably not perfect. The agencies were working with the provincial judicial authorities, and some cases were brought, but it's as much the deterrent factor, I think, that as it is the actual bringing to justice of this thing. So through the communications, and that our sense was that by the time we did the household surveys 8 months after the disaster, I mean, we kind of what we picked up was that actually it had, there was not, Mozambique is known for PSEA and in previous disasters, and this, we just didn't see that as same level of scale, and we had the conversations the enumerators were having were quite open, and so I think we came out fairly confidently saying that certainly the problem was not completely eradicated. Were they all being reported? No, that's definitely not. But was it increasingly being reported? Yes. What did this have a mitigating factor? Yes. Okay, just to respond also to the equity versus equality thing. So what that figure means, that basically that if you're targeting according to needs, if you don't have enough, then is it rather than having, if you don't have enough to cover everyone, the tendency was still to distribute equally. So same amount to each family, regardless of needs. But when you actually look at the needs or relative vulnerability of different families, you get some differences. And that's something that was recognized by the local population, and that's why they responded that, okay, yeah, like all families got something, but did the people that really needed it the most get what they needed? Only a third. That's what that means. And that's the sort of key there's a few things to do with that, which is including strengthening this complaints mechanism so it really is accessible to everybody, but it's also this sort of greater involvement of the CSOs, the civil society actors. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. I have one follow-up question regarding, okay, could you elaborate on how you measured the outcomes of the response provided to the most vulnerable or the most difficult to reach parts of the population? And there the audience is talking specifically about persons with disabilities or elder people. Also, on what basis or on which basis or which criteria that you took on the issues of some parts of the population? And this was specifically asked in connection to a message received from the National Disability Working Group under the Protection Cluster in Mozambique, which expressed concerns that the final IAHE report does not mention disability, despite persons with disability being disproportionately impacted by the cyclone. Perhaps Jocky can comment on this first before I ask further questions.
Yeah, actually, I responded to a message about this last week, so hopefully they got a response. I think actually the comment, just to kind of clarify that comment, I think their comment was that disability wasn't specifically mentioned in the executive summary. We actually have a couple of sections devoted to persons with disability within the main report. And also in the recommendation, we make specific recommendation to improve assistance to disability, and it's very much related to this question, this sort of discussion around equality versus equity. So clearly, persons with disability is part of those vulnerable groups that require that would be prioritized for assistance, and so that means being in a better position to be able to identify at an early stage. I mean, okay, so after a cyclone of that scale hitting that area, wiping out infrastructure, communications were down, the access to some of those areas was cut off for weeks. So there's all these factors there. So it's quite difficult to start targeting from the very beginning, but the kind of approach is to try and as quickly as possible, start identifying those needs, and if it can be done as part of preparedness, even better. But as preparedness, I don't mean necessarily just identifying the people that are there. That's important too, but also identifying those local actors that can help in terms of identifying and reaching those people once the disaster happens. And so one of the recommendations is specifically around that. It's targeted at the HCT. So what I responded to that message was that this should be part of as far as the team is concerned, that could be part of the management response to that recommendation. So what we're saying is, okay, this is based on on the evidence, from the evidence from the household surveys, from the interviews, from the secondary data that we have from other types of evaluations. For example, IFRC did a real-time evaluation, found similar things. So this is an area that needs more attention, and this is what you might do. And so the next step is really that the HCT in Mozambique could take this recommendation and say, okay, is this relevant? And if so, then how do we go about implementing it? Okay.
Perfect. Now we have two questions regarding coordination structures. The first one is, can you please elaborate on how you measured the outcomes of the response provided to the... Oh, sorry, I did that already. Sorry. The presenters identified intercluster coordination as an ongoing area needing improvement. Can you please elaborate on that and give us more detail? And that is specifically for both countries. Also on coordination, could you clarify about the coordination mechanisms? Does it really make sense having one system in two very different crises? Does it make sense, or would it not be better to adapt the coordination system in accordance with the governmental and context structures? Over to you.
Is that me?
Yeah,
either one of you.
Yeah.
It's for both countries.
Yeah, why don't you give me a rest? You start. I'll come afterwards.
Okay, great. Perhaps to start with the intercluster question, and I think I very much appreciate the question of saying concretely what does this mean, and I think what we're finding is that, again, more than in the past, you actually see intercluster coordinating structures. So there will be an intercluster working group or an intercluster meeting. But what we found missing was still that the different response sectors come together on specific problems. So in Ethiopia, obviously it was a food crisis, a nutrition crisis. So you would expect that the different components you need to address malnutrition would go hand in hand: food, the nutrition interventions, and the water and sanitation interventions. And that is what still takes a huge amount of effort and time. So rather than having these sort of problem-focused coordination ways where the relevant clusters get together to really walk hand in hand and address what is needed, there are these more general attempts to create intercluster working groups that kind of do a little bit of everything. And I think it's in that problem-oriented way where we still found gaps and also then opportunities to address it. I love that question of challenging whether it makes sense to have the same kind of coordination mechanism in different kinds of emergencies. And I must admit, I did the evaluation of that cluster approach, so the standardized coordination architecture, I don't know how many years ago, but 10 or 12 or something like that. And I'm still a believer. So especially if you have a sudden onset emergency, but somehow any emergency will have a point where you need to react pretty quickly. And at that point in time, it's invaluable to have standard operating procedures, including for the coordination. You just need to have something to start running with it. If you don't have that, you will spend the next 3 months figuring out, oh, what kind of system shall we have? Who shall lead it? Maybe you, maybe me. And you don't want to waste that time at the beginning of the response. I also think that the system that we have at the moment with the clusters actually has space for being flexible. So you can bring in the government as a co-coordinator. You can merge it with others if you want to. You can activate certain clusters or not. So for example, in Ethiopia, initially there wasn't a logistics cluster, but then when there was a peak and a real bottlenecks for logistics, they activated it for a certain time, fixed some things, and then deactivated it again. So I think as long as these systems are handled flexibly, to have a starting assumption where it is clear who is responsible, also clear who would put the manpower on the ground to do this task, which is not a very thankful task, I think. It's a lot of energy, and in the end, it's very hard to write into your results report, you know, I held X meetings, but it could be that if that was well done, it was really, really instrumental to creating a good response. So to have clear lead agencies who assume that responsibility, I think is worth a lot. So I would say yes, it's worth it as long as it's handled flexibly in practice.
Yeah, just to complement that, I think we would agree that you need something that's kind of ready to go, even though it's maybe not perfectly fit for purpose. I mean, with Mozambique, the coordination was quite strong, but as you would have seen from the slide, it wasn't a perfect fit. There was the government have different, and we're talking about disaster management mechanisms. It wasn't a perfect fit. They've got everything kind of fell on the social side of things, and not so much on the other parts of the coordination mechanism. So I think that was it for that sort of that transition period. I think that's a different story. I mean, and indeed in Mozambique you saw a kind of transition away from the kind of standardized cluster system into something that was much more government led. It depended on the cluster. In fact, I mean, some of the clusters were quite self-sustained. Some others were you know, government led. I mean, health and WASH, for example, they were very much government led, and so whereas others were more autonomous. And one of the advantages in the Mozambique response was that in the beginning, everybody, government agencies, everyone were in this huge building next to the airport, which was apparently, that was before we arrived, but it was incredibly noisy. But it had the advantage of putting everybody together and making sure that everybody was coordinating quite closely. And so the coordination in the beginning was actually very, very close between government and clusters, the different clusters and so forth. And gradually, as people moved out, it became a little bit less connected. In the Mozambique example, I think we found, there were gaps. I mean, part of that was as I mentioned, there were kind of the turnover played an issue. Some of the clusters suffered more from that than others, but you got people coming in who would only stay for quite short time, and it would be not just coordinators but also information managers. It's quite a quick turnover for some clusters, some gaps, so there wasn't sort of a proper handover. Also, the other thing that Mozambique is Portuguese speaking, so it meant that international meetings were in English, government were in Portuguese, and that's something that's familiar to many of you, I'm sure. In terms of the actual, and then also there's different ways that they're measuring performance, and you would have seen that one of the recommendations in the report is actually to look a little bit more carefully at how the rather than using the HRP as a performance measurement reference, that couldn't we come up with a better system so that we're actually using benchmarks that would help to kind of make incentivize clusters to report performance, particularly in terms of outcomes, in a way that it's not comparing apples and oranges, if you like. But at the same time, I mean, I have to say that in Mozambique, there was very strong leadership at the top from the international community. The HCT was based in Maputo, but at field level, the leadership was quite strong. The DHCT, Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator, DHC, okay. Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator was there for some months, which helped a lot. And OCHA Kenya deployed senior staff to Maputo to help at that level in terms of communication, in terms of liaison and so forth. And we got a lot of positive feedback from agencies and government about the response. So, even though there's quite a lot of turnover within the clusters and so forth, that sort of it kind of showed that consistency at the leadership level is quite important. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And now, because things are not difficult enough, I want to ask, in this incredibly challenging period in the light of COVID, are the findings actually still valid? And also, both countries have faced and are still facing significant challenges with recent political unrest. Has this impacted on the relevance of the findings? And can you comment to what degree will we still be able to address the identified shortcomings in the present scenarios? Also, we have another questions from the audience. Many findings are pertinent to the current scale-up, but is there anything specific you would recommend as a priority in the current responses in northern Mozambique and northern Ethiopia? We have very little time left over, but over to you both. Maybe you can try to be fairly short and specific. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tanya. I'll give it my best, and I'll start perhaps with the more specific question of saying, because it's the same question about how relevant are the findings still today. I would say, given the situation that we have now with conflict and a new humanitarian response needed in the northern parts of both countries, the really most important thing is not to rush and forget about learning what we just identified, but to take the time and say, okay, really, we always run from emergency to emergency. It's kind of humanitarian nature, but it is so important to stop and think and just consider what we identified, because as we saw in Ethiopia, even lessons that were identified 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we're still not quite there. So let's make sure we take some of these lessons on board. Now, what are they? I would pick out two specifically for that violence related aspect. The one is to inform people better. I think in both responses, we found that the affected people knew very little about what they were supposed to get, when, how, why. Now, that's already a problem when you have a natural disaster, because if you then have certain suspicions about your local government, for example, not passing on, or the local aid agency not passing on the things as required, it's really problematic not to have that information. But in a conflict or violence setting, it's all the more important, because only if people are informed can they understand that the assistance is provided in a neutral and impartial way. Otherwise, there will always be room for suspicion that things are not being shared fairly, equitably, and according to humanitarian principles. And hand in hand goes the question about the data systems that Jock in his part of the presentation emphasized. There are still quite some gaps in terms of how well the data comes together on what the needs are, and as a result, how we can respond in a targeted way. And again, I think this is more important in a conflict setting than in a natural disaster setting. But Tanya, you asked things also more generally and about that generally changed situation on COVID. And I think COVID is a little bit different because at least for the moment, it changes the context conditions for delivering humanitarian assistance. And I believe that just emphasizes certain of the elements that we've seen or that we've not seen. So for example, obviously now that we're all much more restricted in terms of where we can go and how we can move, that makes it more important to link with local systems, the government systems, as we have already heard, but also the local and the national NGOs. And I have a hope, at least, that this agenda, which is old now, we have a commitment from the World Humanitarian Summit, the Grand Bargain about localization. But I hope that perhaps this change situation due to COVID will kind of push us over the edge so that we actually really implement it and act on it. And there are a couple of very concrete points where we can do that as a humanitarian system. For example, with the country-based pooled funds, which we can design such that they really focus on financing local organizations directly. I have to be brief, so I'll leave it at that and hand over to.
Yeah, so it's getting dark here already. But anyway, I'm still here. So yeah, just to repeat or support what Julia said. I mean, now that we've had doing some other evaluations in COVID times, we really see the value of this sort of local capacities and including the members in the affected population themselves. I mean, where access is difficult or challenged in some ways, they've really become very, very, very important, I think, and not just in Mozambique, but elsewhere. And that in northern Mozambique, it's an example that access is constrained, and was even when we were there. I mean, we didn't look at specifically at northern Mozambique because that was struck by a second cyclone, a smaller cyclone, but in some ways the response was as complex in a different way, and that access was problematic already because you had IDPs, you already had a conflict in the area. There, I mean, I think it's a different kind of response. So we didn't do the evaluation of Kenneth, but we did interview a lot of people who had been involved with that, and the kind of takeaway, which is not in the report, but I think sort of on a side note, I think is that there the kind of contextual analysis is really key. You need a kind of risk analysis, a really very strong risk analysis framework, and good communication strategy, as Julia mentioned. And but otherwise, I think that the main lessons from COVID in terms of, are these relevant? Yes, but in, you know, there's a particular focus in terms of less reliance on this sort of surge, you know, sending in people, and more in terms of building what's there and building up these community communication systems, not just complaint systems, but, you know, communication systems in general, which is already happening, but this is maybe a wake-up call that we need to focus a bit more on those. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. We have one more question, and then I will ask both of you to please share final takeaways of not more than 1 minute, if you wish. The final question is: the HRP was a good resource mobilization tool, you said, but needs tweaking to be fit for purpose. And can you please elaborate on that? And then please share your 1 minute final takeaways before we close. Thank you very much. Julia, over to you.
Well, that's Jock who said that, so I think he should.
Well, whoever wants to start.
Yeah, okay.
And Jock, over to you, and then Julia for the final minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think we suggested tweaking the HRP. I mean, the HRP as it is, it's more of a fundraising tool. I can if somebody wants to send me an email, I can refer them to a piece of work I did for IASC a couple of years ago, which looks specifically at HRP and what they're good at and what they're not. And it was a study to look at a better way of costing HRPs. But for the specific Mozambique one, the recommendation is actually not necessarily to tweak the HRP. That's more of a kind of system-wide change that needs to happen for HRPs to become more, less of a kind of, well, yeah, we won't go into that now. Anyway, you can read the paper if you send me an email. But what the recommendation was that there is provision within the scale-up protocol for the HCTs in the affected country, in this case Mozambique, to set their own benchmarks. So they can do that, and that's, you'll see that in the annex of the report, what the benchmarks that the HCT in Mozambique set for themselves. And that to us was a much easier way of measuring performance than the different indicators in the HRP. So basically the recommendation was to set up not necessarily a separate system, but a system, kind of strengthen those benchmarks that are set up by the HCT, using not necessarily blueprint indicators, but some kind of comparable indicators, so you can compare results between IAHEs to get some kind of meaningful comparison, and that could be systematized a bit more without necessarily, you know, imposing benchmarks on the HCT. It's natural, it's normal that they should be developed for there should be performance benchmarks that are appropriate to the specific context, and that also align with whatever the system the government is using. So they need to be adaptable, but at the same time, it's a way of measuring performance at the level of communities, rather than this sort of high level, you know, what these are, what we think the needs are, and this is the money we need type of approach. Okay.
Julia, your 1 minute closing remarks.
I'd actually like to link back right to what Kelly said at the very beginning, that, you know, in the humanitarian system, it's quite remarkable that we actually have such tools like the interagency humanitarian evaluations. There is a system there that is making that effort and tries to see for the system as a whole what's going well, where do we have gaps, and how can we learn. But is not what we have, for example, in the development system. And even though I think as an evaluator, of course, the juicy stuff is always where things are not yet perfect. So you pick out where can we still further improve and improve. But I think I just want to end on that note of saying we have seen a lot of progress on this. I think even that we're here today with so many emergencies going on and so much really urgent stuff that needs to be done, that we're here talking about how we can further learn is really fabulous. And sometimes if we compare to other systems, it's really a cause of something to be proud of, because it's not normal to find.
Okay, that's actually a wonderful closing sentence. So thank you very much, Julia. And I will refrain from trying to summarize the very many nuggets that we had during this extremely challenging and very interesting briefing. We have run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you to our audience. Thank you for the interesting questions asked. Thank you very much to our presenters for sharing your insights and for this extremely valuable briefing. I also want to say thank you to my colleagues in the IASC Secretariat who organized this briefing, and please come back. We are going to organize further IASC briefings, and you will find information on everything that's coming forward on our website. We'll also share it by email, and we'll share it in our newsletter. So do stay engaged. Please come back. Until then, stay well and see you soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.